We're going to spend the next 45 minutes just talking about chronic disease and what are some of the specific risk factors for chronic disease here in Australia. And I think it's extraordinarily important for us to understand really what's going on. Tomorrow, as Nathan hinted in the program, we're going to talk about the other half of that. What are some of the particularly important foods that we need to be eating to help us to treat or even to prevent if possible? So let's get started. We're first going to look at what's called the Australian Health Report that was released in 2012. It tells us that we have an extraordinarily growing chronic disease crisis here in Australia. Type 2 diabetes is growing at an alarming rate. The number of people with diabetes has actually doubled in the last 20 years, which is very alarming. So we have almost 1 million Australians who have what we call type 2 diabetes. And there's also a very significant number of people who have what's called pre-diabetes, which means that they're at risk. They might have a family history. So 2 million people with at-risk diabetes is a real concern. In the US, we compare fairly similarly to US rates as well, where 8% of the US population has diabetes. We have 4%, but 4% is an alarming amount. And with cancer, although people are actually living longer with cancer because of excellent diagnostic tools and also better treatment, it still remains one of our major killers, with 29% of people dying from cancer. But cardiovascular disease, that means heart disease or stroke, is actually still our biggest killer here in Australia. There's no doubt that these chronic diseases are directly related to our lifestyle. The way we eat is actually responsible for about 63% of deaths globally. By addressing dietary and lifestyle issues, we can reduce that risk, which is the great news. So this afternoon, we're going to discuss how what we eat can either increase or reduce our risk for chronic disease and death. And then tomorrow afternoon, as I've mentioned already, we're going to talk about how we can fight these diseases and even better still, prevent them. We're going to look at some particular foods tomorrow afternoon and how they actually work directly to fight those diseases. And I will share some of the latest research with you as well. So heart disease, diabetes and cancer all share common risk factors. Now that's a really important point for me to emphasise with you this afternoon, and you'll hear me say this as we go through. So such things as smoking, unhealthy diets, inactivity, and also the harmful use or alcohol are very common risk factors for all of these chronic diseases that we've mentioned. But most researchers now really believe that obesity should be added to this list, as it's an outcome of unhealthy diets and inactivity, and it's a very, very significant risk factor for heart disease, diabetes and cancer, as we'll see this afternoon. We are an obese nation, with 2/3 of adults and 25% or 1 in 4 children who are overweight or obese. This is a dramatic change from the 1980s, when the reverse was actually true. 60% of us actually had healthy weight. So this is quite alarming. It's therefore not an exaggeration to say that we actually have an obesity epidemic. Most people are aware that obesity is a risk factor for heart disease and diabetes, but don't actually realise that it's a risk factor for cancer as well. And we're going to talk a lot about that in a moment. So over the last 20 years, obesity rates around the world have increased significantly. So it's not just an issue for Australia. The US has the highest rates, then comes Mexico, then comes the UK, and who comes next? Australia, that's right. Our obesity rates, as I said before, have doubled in the last 20 years, as has diabetes. Obesity has recently been defined by the American Medical Association as a major chronic disease, as serious as heart disease and cancer. We used to think of obesity as it's a symptom or a condition, but now we actually call it a chronic disease. There's no question that overfeeding is going to result in increased weight, but that happens to different degrees according to genetic factors. However, genetic factors can't actually explain the rapid increase in excess body fat and the rates of obesity over the last 20 to 30 years. We know that interactions between our environment and our genes can have a very significant influence on our health outcomes, as we're going to discuss later. Obesity, in fact, has overtaken smoking as a leading cause of premature death. Isn't that an extraordinary thing? We know that smoking now, the rates have reduced significantly because of all the very, very good public health awareness programs. So now really public health messages should be looking at the issues of obesity. Jamie Oliver quotes researchers when he says, "We, the adults of the last generation," that's you and me, "have blessed our children with the destiny of a shorter lifespan than their own parents because of the landscape of food that we've built around them." I think most of you would agree with that. Based on present trends, researchers are predicting that this present generation, young people, if you're out there, that's you. You will have a shorter life expectancy than your parents due to this issue of obesity. Unfortunately, our typical Aussie diet, to call it the standard Australian diet or the SAD diet, is implicated in the causes of obesity and disease. It's considered actually an affluent, westernised diet that's high in energy, foods that are rich in sugar, salt and fat. You probably are aware that people who move to Australia from non-Western countries adopt and then adopt our diet, actually adopt our chronic diseases as well. So these are what we call diseases of affluence. A recent nationwide health survey has found that 35% of the calories or kilojoules that Australians eat actually comes from highly processed, nutrient-poor, or what we would call junk food. That's high in refined carbs, high in fat, high in salt, high in sugar. So that really boils down to about 1 in 3 meals, doesn't it? So it's little wonder that we have a chronic disease crisis on our hands. Obesity is a normal response to an abnormal environment. It's often referred to as the obesogenic environment. We're living in a society where food is available everywhere and at any time. It's faster, cheaper, more calorie or kilojoule dense, and more easily accessible than ever before, and we're constantly exposed to the marketing of such. Fast food outlets and highly processed, high-calorie advertised foods are screaming at us to eat more when we have less and less time to prepare food at home. It's all advertised as fun, happiness, sex appeal, prestige, but they never ever mention the impact of health, do they? Serving sizes have grown dramatically. We seem to get more for our money, which may be good for the wallet, but it's not so good for our waistline, is it? And supermarkets are interested in the health of what? The bottom line. They're not interested in our own health. Our healthcare system focuses on helping people survive who live on these unhealthy diets and an unhealthy lifestyle. Shouldn't they be focusing more on prevention instead? I just wanted to show you this graph that I found. It's showing the increase in the number of fast food outlets around Australia from the 1999 or 2000 going all the way and it's projecting up to 2017. But you can see that there's a significant growth in this area, which is terribly unfortunate. It's not a surprise because McDonald's, just to give you a little trivia statistic, back in the 1980s, they were spending about $6 million on advertising for their outlets. And in 2005, we know that they're spending $55 million on advertising. So they're keen for your business, believe me. A Western style diet is typically high in saturated fat and trans fats. It's high in sodium, sugar, kilojoules or calories, typically low in fibre. There's very little fruit and vegetables, fast foods and processed foods, and of course alcohol. So here's an example, for instance, on the left, of a Western style breakfast, bacon, sausages and fried eggs. And the dinner meal on the right-hand side, which is steak, mashed potatoes, gravy. You can't see the apple pie and ice cream, but I can assure you it's in there, contains a total of 130 grams of fat. And I did the analysis on this. That's mostly saturated fat. So there's the 130 grams, and it actually looks a bit like this, about 26 cubes or teaspoons equivalent of fat in that meal alone, which represents about, and if you're a calorie person like me, I still think in calories, that's around 1,200 calories for the meal, that one meal alone, just from the fat, let alone the protein and carbohydrate, and or kilojoules, around 5,000 kilojoules. Now, immediately, we know this from research, after eating a meal such as one of these, your blood will increase in stickiness, your arteries will become damaged, and a blood clot is more likely to form. And I'm going to explain exactly how that actually works so you can visualise that and be more aware. I thought I'd just pop in this picture. Now, this is really interesting. If you've ever visited the US, you may have seen something like this. Here's a restaurant chain in the US called Heart Attack Grill. And it boasts as being the home to the triple bypass burger. How's that? And it claims to serve food, quote unquote, worth dying for. Isn't that astonishing? People will go and eat there. And you know, all the other fast food restaurants are similarly bad, but they don't flaunt it quite the same way. We now have an overwhelming amount of research that tells us that higher rates of red and processed meats are associated with increased risk of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, colorectal cancer, and mortality. So what are the actual dietary factors that will increase your risk of chronic diseases? So what are the elements within this Western style diet that are particularly a concern? Well, first up, there's what we call refined carbohydrate, and that's what you'll find in, you know, cakes and biscuits and cookies and donuts, the white bread and highly refined breakfast cereals. And then there's saturated fat, which is typically in meat and dairy, as well as cakes and biscuits and other refined foods. Cholesterol, you find that in only animal products like meat and dairy. And then there's something called pro-oxidants or toxins. These are actually produced when processed food with fat and sugar are made. This is called AGES, A-G-E-S is the acronym, and it's called Advanced Glycated End Products. You also have something called nitrosamines, which are the byproducts of cooking meats at high temperatures. And we'll talk about why those are a problem later. Excessive salt, you'll find mostly in highly processed foods, and excessive sugars. The primary source of that is in things like your sugar-sweetened beverages. We know that for good health, we should all be eating at least 2 serves of fruit a day and 5 serves of veggies. The Go for 2 and 5 campaign was designed to encourage people to eat the recommended serves, and some of you may have seen some of that work in the media. But a recent survey, we call it the Australian Health Survey, and we're getting lots of very good data from this survey, so as more information comes out, we'll be able to share more and more with you. But this was an astonishing statistic. Only half of Australians eat the 2 fruits recommended serves per day. Only half, so about 48.3% eat the required 2 pieces of fruit, and that might just simply be a banana and an apple. Perhaps even more astonishing is that 1 in 10 Australians eat the recommended 5 serves of veggies. Look at that right over on the right-hand side there. Only just under 10% of Australians will eat the 5 veggies. So taking both of these guidelines into account, it tells us that only about 5% of Australian adults actually have the required fruit and vegetables in their diet. So what is it about fruits and veggies and other plant foods that help to decrease risk of disease? Well, there are very important things called bioactive components. And these include dietary fibre, antioxidants, phytonutrients, plant sterols and stanols, plant fats, vitamins and minerals. It's important to note that in most cases, these dietary factors are not found in meat. So the beneficial foods, the beneficial bioactive components are only found in plant foods. Only found in plant foods. Very important to remember. There is no dietary fibre in meat. Some people think, oh, no, meat's got fibre, hasn't it? No, it hasn't. Now, apart from vitamin B12 and vitamin D, you can actually get all of your vitamins and minerals from plant foods. And Wednesday afternoon, I will be talking specifically about B12 and vitamin D and some other nutrients in plant-based diet that people have some questions about. So I'll be really keen to share that information with you on Wednesday afternoon. Loma University in California has been studying plant-based diets since the 1950s. So for 70 years now, essentially, we've been doing considerable amount of study on this area. Other major institutions, such as Oxford University and Harvard School of Public Health, have also been studying plant-based diets, and there have been other institutions as well, but these are the ones that have done some of the biggest studies. These are very large cohort studies, and therefore actually provide us with very, very strong and very useful evidence. So much of what we actually know about today in terms of dietary factors and chronic disease actually comes from these studies. So here are some key findings, and I'm only going to give you a little teaser this afternoon because most of this I'm going to talk about tomorrow. But some of the key findings from these global studies include things like fruits and vegetables will reduce your heart disease risk and also cancer. Nuts and whole grains reduce your risk of heart disease. Red and processed meats increase your risk of colon cancer. Legumes will protect you from colon cancer. Tomatoes and soy will reduce your risk of prostate cancer, and soy, breast cancer. And we know that all vegetarian groups, that's vegan and lacto-ovo vegetarians, have a lower cancer risk than meat eaters. And specific female cancers, such as endometrial, breast cancer, ovarian cancer, those risks are much lower in vegans. So I want you to notice, actually, that these studies were focusing on foods. So we're talking about fruits, nuts, whole grains, legumes, tomatoes, soy, etc. These are foods. These are not nutrients. So it's not saturated fat, it's not cholesterol, it's not folate, it's not B vitamins. It's food items that actually help to lower your risk of these cancers. There are large health organisations that are recommending that we eat more plant foods and reduce our meat intake. So these organisations have taken these studies, these very well designed large studies, and have made recommendations based on the evidence. So for instance, the World Cancer Research Fund, which is one of the largest institutions that looks and studies cancer, recommends eating mostly foods of plant origin and reducing red meat consumption. Then we have the American Institute of Cancer Research, which is linked with the World Cancer Research Fund, and they say no single food or food component can protect you against cancer by itself, but strong evidence does show that a diet filled with a variety of plant foods such as vegetables, fruits, whole grains and beans, helps to lower your risk of many cancers. And again, we're looking at that in more detail in a moment. The World Health Organization Global Strategy on Diet, Physical Activity and Health. This is a strategy that's used by countries around the world to help them to devise their own dietary guidelines. They recommend increasing consumption of fruit and vegetables, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and reducing meat intake. So that was the World Health Organization. These are very large organizations. Based on this, governments around the world are recommending that we eat more fruits and vegetables and less meat. In fact, our own Australian dietary guidelines were revised last year in February 2013, and they actually recommended a limit on red meat intake and processed meat intake, and also recommended an increase in legumes. At Sanitarium, one of the things that Sanitarium does, and I'm very involved in, is advocacy for plant-based diets. So we actually wrote submissions to the National Health and Medical Research Council when they were in the process of revising the Australian dietary guidelines. And I always think of Sanitarium as the David in the David and Goliath story, if you know what I mean. We are the little voice out there, but have God's blessing behind us. So our submissions were all carefully looked at, and as we looked at the final revised version of the guidelines, we could see that they had taken notice of what we had said should be included in there about the benefits of plant-based diets. So we were very, very, very pleased about that. Of course, there's a long way that they should go, but at least they did listen to us when we provided them the evidence on plant-based diets and how it helps to reduce chronic disease risk. Not only do these studies tell us about the benefits of plant foods, but they also tell us that plant-based diets, people who eat plant-based diets, actually enjoy a longer life. Research done on the longest lived communities in Okinawa, Costa Rica, Loma Linda and Sardinia was documented in the book The Blue Zones. I wonder how many of you have heard of the book The Blue Zones. It's really a very readable book, but gives you extraordinarily good information. Dan Buettner, who's the author of that, came out and visited us at Sanitarium a couple of years ago, and we were able to do quite a lot of media work with him. He worked with Loma Linda on some of the research from Loma Linda and was able to publish this book, but also get this information showcased in the National Geographic magazine some years ago. He was able to show that most of the diets of these traditional communities was plant-based. These people lived very simple, very active lives, and as a consequence had the lowest incidence of chronic disease globally. So it's very, very good information. Some argue that it's our genes that are responsible for our chronic disease, and there's not much that we can do about that. We do know that our individuality is certainly determined by the genes that are encoded by our DNA, no question, but we are not destined to poor health if we've inherited some poor genes. There is a new area of research which is telling us that decisions that we make about our diet and our lifestyle are actually more important than the genes that we were actually born with. This new area of research is called epigenetics. Epi means on, genes. It tells us that our DNA isn't necessarily our destiny. It's all about the choices we make, the choices we make can change our genes and even our children's genes. So epigenetics, it's such an interesting area, refers to how our environment can alter how our genes function. It can turn genes on that should be off, or off that should be on. So these environmental factors that can actually make these alterations to our genes include things like diet, pollution, smoking, alcohol, stress, radiation, and even some chemical exposure. So this means that lifestyle choices, including what we choose to eat, may be actually more powerful than our genes. Now, an interesting example of this, I'm just going to give you this example from the American Institute of Cancer Research website, and I'll give you that website. Well, there it is on the screen, and I highly recommend that you go to this website. It's got so much information. There is a peptide in soy, for instance, called lunasin, which can actually disrupt the process that's involved in the DNA coiling, if you like, without affecting the DNA sequence. This lunasin will change the way that the cell works. It can kill the cancer cells, so it will affect the cancer cells, killing them, but leaving the cell, otherwise the normal cells, intact. So lunasin actually could be preventative against a number of cancers in which this type of coiling around the DNA actually is involved. And institutes like the American Institute of Cancer Research are actually doing a lot of research in how foods can actually help to reduce cancer risk through this whole epigenetic process. Now, the choices that you make can change your genes and your children's genes, passing from generation to generation. This is known as transgenerational inheritance. This happens to be my family. There are my two tall red-headed twin boys with their wives and our two little grandchildren. During pregnancy, a woman can positively influence the child's future health and well-being, potentially safeguarding him or her from chronic disease or being overweight. So it's really quite sobering, isn't it? Because I think about, okay, what did I do when I was pregnant that actually has now affected my boys, my young men, my sons' health, and what are they doing also to affect their children's health? So we need to remember that how we choose to eat will not only affect ourselves, but our children and our grandchildren. And the great news is we all have a choice. We can choose what direction we're going to go in, whether we're going to consider these matters or whether we're going to ignore them and just hope that everything works out okay. The great news is that lifestyle-induced diseases, such as the ones we've talked about, are almost entirely preventable and are largely reversible. Now I'm going to talk about another area of research which has really opened our minds to how food and our environment affect our likelihood for disease or not. Most people understand that our body's basic response to fighting infection, or if we've hit our thumb with a hammer, it shows, it gets very red, it's inflamed, it's very sore, it's very warm. It shows that the body is actually working very hard through our immune system to fight that infection and to repair that tissue. And they're actually blood markers called C-reactive protein, which will go up. It goes up in the blood in response to this infection, telling us that an infection is actually happening or an inflammation. But after that cut or that sore thumb, that bruise, after it's healed itself, the immune system turns itself off, as it should, and those biomarkers of inflammation, C-reactive protein, will go down. But there is a time when that may not happen. The immune response doesn't turn itself off completely, and C-reactive proteins remain high. This is a time when what we call chronic inflammation. It's another type of inflammation. It's not acute, where it turns on and then off. This is a low-grade, long-term inflammatory condition. It's called the secret killer. It's a silent predator that you can't feel or see. But if you're living a typical Western lifestyle, diet, inactivity, etc., it's slowly damaging your cells throughout your body. It's your body in a constant state of fighting disease, fighting the assaults of poor lifestyle choices. So researchers now know that this is actually the link between a Western diet and lifestyle and many of those chronic diseases. Chronic inflammation. So it's usually the result of being overweight, poor diet, inactivity, smoking, alcohol, and chemical pollutants. They all of those together actually produce in our body something called free radicals. And you actually develop an unhealthy build-up of these free radicals. And a combination of all of those together can actually be quite lethal. And just a little word on that excessive weight that some of us are carrying around our middle. It really is quite a health risk, because these are not just dormant fat cells. They're actually producing hormones. And those hormones, leptin and estrogen, are actually contributing to what we call this chronic inflammation process. So free radicals from our poor diet and our lifestyle choices are actually creating this condition, chronic inflammation. We refer to this as the pro-inflammatory lifestyle. So now what we're going to do for the rest of the afternoon is actually look at how that works in heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. First, a little more about free radicals so you understand these. They are the harmful invaders of our body. They attack and they damage our cell membranes, leaving the cell vulnerable to further damage. This then makes the DNA, and every cell has some DNA, inside the cell more prone to damage, and the epigenetic changes that we talked about. So that's how the epigenetic influence happens. It actually starts by damaging the DNA. This damage is called sometimes oxidation, or often chronic inflammation. It's really like our bodies are rusting on the inside. So free radicals not only damage our DNA and affect our epigenetics, our genes through epigenetics, but they can also alter our cells' energy systems, they can oxidize cholesterol, and we'll hear more about that in a minute. They alter our immune system. All of these contribute to chronic inflammation and are the cause of cancer, aging, even Alzheimer's, and degenerative diseases. Now, if you think you're free of heart disease, you may want to consider this statement. all males 65 years and older and all females 70 years and older who've been exposed to the traditional Western diet have cardiovascular disease and should be treated as such. This was a cardiologist writing just a few years ago in the States. From his experience, this was what he saw. It's really very alarming. Heart disease is largely due to a lifetime of eating this Western-style diet, but the disease can actually start a lot earlier, even in your adolescence, and some even earlier than that. They've even seen 9-year-olds with the beginnings of heart disease. Now, there's a new way of thinking about heart disease. Certainly it's not what I was taught when I was at university. There's new research out there, so let's look and see what this is all about. Now, as babes, we all start out with very nice, smooth, supple arteries around our heart. We call these the coronary arteries because they sit around like a crown around the heart, as you see there. They're unblemished. They're the nice, smooth inner lining of our artery wall. And we call that artery wall the endothelium. And you'll hear me talk about that a little bit now because it's extraordinarily important. Something I never heard about when I was a student at university. With your poor diet and your inactivity, whitish streaks start to stain the endothelium. That's those lovely, nice, clean arteries. And then plaque starts to build. Now, cardiologists realise that factors other than just high cholesterol increase our risk for heart disease. It's no longer just a matter of cholesterol building up and blocking the arteries. So it's not just a plumbing problem anymore. Instead, they see atherosclerosis as a chronic condition, largely driven by this chronic inflammation. So when high blood cholesterol levels are accompanied by this chronic inflammation, that's when damage occurs to the arteries and heart disease starts. So heart disease starts with some insult or injury to this delicate inner lining of our artery wall. So this injury or this inflammation of the endothelium can be caused by high blood pressure, high blood sugar, high cholesterol, high triglycerides, smoking, or even an infection. This chronic inflammation is when heart disease starts. It's a slow, steady development of atherosclerosis. So let's see how this actually happens. When the artery is damaged and inflamed, the bad cholesterol, you've heard of LDL cholesterol, of course, will attach itself to the endothelium. So inside, on that nice little lining there, it starts to attach itself. The body tries to heal itself. It's responding to this inflammatory condition by forming a scab over this sore, which then develops as a plaque. This plaque can suddenly become unstable and can burst open, starting to form a blood clot, which in turn will block the artery eventually, and often that happens quite suddenly. Now that can happen with big plaques or even small plaques, big vessels or even small vessels around the heart. And this is what happens when you have a stroke, but it's actually happening in the brain rather than in your heart. So a healthy diet and lifestyle will ensure that your arteries will stay nice and healthy and actually don't get diseased and inflamed and have blood clots like this. So let's look at type 2 diabetes. It's a chronic disease that results from a combination of genetic and environmental factors. Although genes are a factor, risk is greatly increased by your lifestyle factors: overweight, high blood pressure, inactivity, and poor diet. It usually starts later in life, but more and more it's being seen in children, and it's characterised usually by high blood sugars which must be constantly managed. Since it's a lifestyle-related disease, treatment focuses on lifestyle management behaviours. The pre-diabetes I mentioned earlier, which we think of as used to think of as borderline diabetes, is where blood glucose levels are higher than normal, but not high enough to be classed as diabetes. This is common in people who have a family history or are inactive or overweight. This is actually a diagnostic warning sign. It must be taken seriously, and it's an opportunity to make some lifestyle changes. So if you know somebody in your family, or if you're somebody who's been diagnosed with pre-diabetes, please don't ignore it. It really is time to take action. The good news is that 60% or more of diabetes cases can actually be prevented or at least delayed. And we believe with plant-based diets you can actually reverse. Now don't be confused, this is not the same as type 1 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes was considered a lifestyle chronic disease. Type 1 diabetes is something that occurs because your body no longer makes insulin, and it's a whole different reasoning. It can actually occur in childhood, as some of you may know someone with this condition, and of course insulin injections are needed for life. So let's just explain type 2 diabetes a little bit more and why we can't ignore it. For our bodies to work properly, we need to convert food that we eat, particularly the carbohydrates and the sugars, from food into energy. It's a hormone called insulin that does this work, and it's essential for converting the foods that we eat for energy, like carbohydrate, into energy in our cells. In people with diabetes, type 2 diabetes, insulin is no longer working properly. It's particularly true if you're overweight or inactive. This situation is actually called insulin resistance. So when people with diabetes eat their food, they can't actually convert this into energy, and of course they can get quite tired. There's all kinds of symptoms around this that indicate that you're at risk for type 2 diabetes. So as a result of not being able to convert this into energy, this glucose in the blood actually builds up, and the high levels of blood glucose actually damage the arteries and damage the blood vessels. And that's the kind of damage that happens in the heart as well. But it also happens in the brain, makes you more susceptible to things like Alzheimer's, for instance. It can happen in the eye, so blindness, in the heart, as I've mentioned. Kidneys, chronic kidney failure is one of the terrible outcomes of uncontrolled type 2 diabetes. And also peripheral nerve damage. So that's nerve damage in your fingers and in your toes, and that can lead to very significant problems, including amputation. Obesity plays a very major role in the development of high blood glucose and insulin resistance, which leads to this chronic inflammation, the damaged blood vessels, and ultimately diabetes. Now, with high blood sugar levels as well as high blood fats, you may actually be at an increased risk of heart disease. So people with diabetes actually have a double risk for heart disease. So it's a very, very important thing to get under control. So again, the causes are poor diet. Poor diet, inactivity, obesity, and chronic inflammation. A healthy plant-based diet and some increased activity is a good, wonderful prescription for type 2 diabetes, for managing it. And losing even just a few kilos of weight can be very effective in managing your blood glucose levels and reducing your risk. And that's really why the CHIP program, if you are aware of the newly revised CHIP program, is such an excellent program for people wanting to reduce risk for diabetes or to help them to manage it better. They've had some extraordinarily good outcomes. Now, tomorrow we're going to talk more about the ways to fight diabetes with the kinds of foods that you need to include in your diet And these kinds of recommendations aren't just for people with diabetes, but for the whole family. So it's a way of eating for the whole family to enjoy, but also to help to prevent or manage diabetes. So cancer, our third and last chronic disease that we'll talk about this afternoon. Cancer is another chronic disease that most concerns Australians. The primary cause of cancer is poor diet, inactivity, and obesity. Many people don't realise that overweight or obesity is a risk factor. I mentioned that earlier. Cells are damaged by chronic inflammation, and this is often where cancer starts. So again, chronic inflammation is a very underlying silent killer that we need to be aware of. Epigenetics can also play a role, as we've mentioned, in development of disease, where it turns off genes or turns on genes and has quite a significant impact on the growth or not of cancer. The good news is that 30 to 40% of cancers can be prevented by improving our diet and lifestyle. Now, an important point I want to emphasise here this afternoon, and hopefully you have picked this up already, that heart disease, diabetes and cancer all share the same risk factors. The changes that you make to improve your diet and lifestyle will not only reduce your risk of heart disease and diabetes, but also your risk for cancer. We learned a lot about cancer and diet back in the 1980s, when researchers looked at the dietary practices and disease rates among a large group of Chinese men and women. Those who'd stopped eating their traditional diet, which was mostly plant food because they grew food on the land, had much higher rates of heart disease and breast cancer and prostate cancer. Obesity, which is rarely seen in the rural Chinese population, was found to be common among those Chinese who were eating a westernised style diet. There was strong evidence that nutrition was the controlling factor in the development. The researcher behind this study, Dr. Colin Campbell, was the senior science advisor at the American Institute of Cancer Research at that time. And it was so interesting for me to read that on the American Institute of Cancer Research website some months ago. I thought that was a wonderful tribute that they made to this wonderful man, Dr. Colin Campbell. His research was actually published in 1994, and some of you will be familiar with the book that he wrote based on that research called The China Study. Research on the relationship between diet and cancer has developed significantly since then and has strengthened our understanding, but the message remains the same. Diet plays a very, very important role in cancer risk. Now, I'm going to apologise because you're not going to see the detail on this, but I'm going to go and show you a little bit more detail in a moment. But this diagram shows the progression of a normal cell over time through to potentially a diseased cancer cell and how that actually happens. On the left, we can see all the factors, and I'll look at these in a minute, that increase the risk of cancer, and on the right, all the factors that will actually reduce the risk of cancer. And again, this is another wonderful graph that you can see on the AICR website. So let's look at the factors that they've got on this chart that are pro-cancer. So they've listed obesity, which we've talked about already, metabolic syndrome. Now that's a combination of heart disease, type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure, and that's a significant risk factor for cancer. Omega-6 fatty acids, I'm going to be talking about that on Wednesday afternoon. Essentially too much of this omega-6 fatty acids can be a problem. Insulin-like growth factor, chronic inflammation, here we've talked about that, so I've explained that to you this afternoon, what that's all about. And then some substances called aflatoxins, which are molds, the nitro compounds and heterocyclic amines, which are found on meats, particularly when they're processed or when they're heated at high temperatures. The fat hormones that are around our gut, our waistline, as I mentioned earlier, all of those have potential to damage our DNA. But what about the anti-cancer effects? Oops. First up, phytonutrients. Now that may be a new word to some of you. Some people call them phytochemicals. Tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to spend most of my time explaining this and why these are so important and what foods we need to be eating, and to make sure that we have foods that help to fight cancer and other diseases. Flavonoids, retinoids and selenium. These are all different types of what we call phytonutrients and antioxidants. And then the omega-3 fatty acids. Now, why would omega-3 be better than omega-6? And I'll talk about that on Wednesday afternoon. Other anti-cancer substances such as zinc, curcumin, which is a type of substance in a spice, lycopenes, the ACE vitamins, A, C and E, genistein, which is in soy, polyphenols, which are another phytonutrient, and folate. All of those have the potential to protect our cells. And guess where they all come from? Do they come from meat or dairy? They come from plant, exactly. Researchers, again at the American Institute of Cancer Research, have found that this is in the US, this is a US statistic, 38% of breast cancers can be prevented by improving your lifestyle choices, and they say by staying lean, eating smarter and moving more. And also 50% of colorectal cancer cases can be prevented with the same strategies of staying lean, eating smart and moving more. Did you know that Australia has the highest levels of colorectal cancer in the world? But as we've heard, at least 50% of those can be prevented by changing our lifestyle. Now here's a quick look at how to prevent bowel cancer according to the American Institute of Cancer Research. So they say stay a healthy weight, move more, eat a healthier diet. That means eating more plant foods, fibre-rich plant foods, limiting red meat and not drinking alcohol. And tomorrow we're going to focus a lot more on that and what that really means and what foods we should be eating. So finally, we'll just mention just briefly about fighting obesity. The bad news, unfortunately, is that long-term very few diets prove effective. There's lots of fad diets out there that claim all kinds of promises that you're going to lose all kinds of weight in all kinds of very short time. But unfortunately, after some initial weight loss, perhaps most people will regain their weight. That's really bad news and sad news. And certainly those who hope to lose weight without increasing their physical exercise are actually doomed to fail. Exercise and a healthy lifestyle of eating good food is very important. They need to go together. So what's the best solution? Well, of course, to prevent it in the first place by eating healthy foods and exercising. So we can certainly help our children and our grandchildren with that. But the good news is, the great news is, that a plant-based diet is naturally lower in calories and can assist with weight loss. And again, the CHIP program has shown that over and over and over. But it's not just the CHIP program. Tomorrow afternoon I'm going to show you some research studies that actually have shown unequivocally that vegan and vegetarian diets are best for weight loss. So the real key in fighting obesity is to make gradual changes to your poor eating habits and your exercise patterns, and make those changes that you can live with long term. I can't emphasize that enough. The fad diets ask you to do all kinds of weird and wonderful things like stand on your head and who knows what else. There's no way in the world you can sustain that for a long time. What you need to do is to eat healthier with foods that we're going to talk about tomorrow afternoon, and exercise, move more. It doesn't mean you have to do amazing triathlons or marathons. Just means get up and move more. That's what that means. So make changes you can live with long term so that you get those long-term results. So just as we finish, I just want to remind you that fortunately the research tells us that there are foods that can fight all of these diseases, including obesity and chronic inflammation. One of the most consistent findings in nutritional epidemiology over the last 10 to 20 years is that plant foods are the key to reducing chronic disease and risk of early death. Now, this was a statement by Professor David Jacobs. I attended the 6th International Congress on Vegetarian Nutrition at Loma last year, and we had some of the top epidemiologists in the world speaking to us about the benefits of plant-based diets. Professor David Jacobs has no particular interest, particularly in the Adventist health message or what studies are being done at Loma. He has made this very unbiased statement, which I think is just extraordinary from a man such as he. And he has written some amazing papers. Some of his latest research is about the importance of eating whole foods, whole plant foods, and why we should be doing that. And that's, for me, has been an extraordinarily interesting study. So you're going to hear me say that a number of times over the next few days, because I want you to remember that we do, in fact, have some amazing evidence from the studies that we've done over these years on plant-based diets and what it means to our health. So tomorrow afternoon we're going to look at the types of foods we need to ensure we include in our diet to enjoy the health benefits that we've talked about and how they directly work in our body to fight disease. Now, you might be smugly thinking, oop, I think I really eat pretty well already. But my experience tells me that many people are actually missing out by not including intentionally some of the very important foods that help to protect us from disease. Or you might be following some fairly misguided information. After all, we all have access to the internet. We all have access to all kinds of amazing information. And we're bombarded, aren't we, with the latest study says this and the latest study says that. How do you know what to believe? Because with every new study comes another gust of, woof, that seems to be so different to what I used to know. What do we believe? What should we believe that's written and printed in the media and on the internet? So I'm going to provide you with some information and helpful links to some useful information on the internet, which you will be able to use on an ongoing basis as a way to check and know what is healthy and what isn't healthy. I'll also help you to assess what's reliable information and what is unreliable information. So that's all I have for you this afternoon, but tomorrow afternoon I'm going to give you lots of really wonderful information about healthy eating and how to tackle some of these diseases. So now is time for questions on anything that I've said this afternoon. I will try. I can't promise that I'll answer. If I can't give you an answer, I will promise to get that answer for you, because one of the things I love to do is go look for answers. And so that's one of the things that they get me to do at Sanitarium. That's the joy of my life.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. I make an observation in terms of nature and nurture that you're speaking of in diet. The experiment of adoption within New Zealand over a period of 40 years indicates nature over nurture. You seem to be indicating nurture over nature in terms of diet and disease. The other thing is, what effect does technology, the radiation that we are continually bombarded with in our cars, in our homes, etc., have on disease? Okay,
the nature-nurture, that's an ongoing debate, isn't it? but it's the epigenetic information that we're getting now that's pretty new information about how it actually can affect with nurture, with the environment that you're raised in, how it does actually have a more significant impact over us, over our genetic inheritance. So that is pretty new information. The nature-nurture argument and debate has been going on for a long time. So I think epigenetics is helping us to understand that a little bit better. I certainly don't pretend to be an expert in that area. It's new information to me. I'm sharing with you new information as I'm understanding it. So I continue to read on this subject. It's a very fascinating area. Thank you. And your question on radiation, that could be an impact possibly in terms of environmental pollutants. But radiation, I'm not an expert on radiation, that's for sure. But some people think, well, you know, you shouldn't be using a microwave because of the radiation from the microwave. Pardon? Mobile phones. Yeah, so, you know, I think there's going to have to be more research on this, and I'm certainly not able to give you a black and white answer on that. Yes?
I was just wondering what your opinion is on the amount of poisons in that is actually sprayed on vegetables, and also with the gassing, like they gas apples to stop them from ripening. They freeze them for a while season, and then they gas them again to ripen them.
Hmm. Yes, we are certainly exposed to some potential problems with the sprays and so forth that are used. One of the reasons we need to be diligent about cleaning our fruits and vegetables is for that reason. If you have a particular concern over that, the best thing to do is to buy organic, of course, or to grow your own. There are a lot of veggies that we can grow in our backyard that you don't have to be subjected to any kind of sprays or pesticides or so forth. And that is something that all of us should be doing much more of, because it's more sustainable as well in terms of the environment. But your point, though, is some people will use that as an argument not to eat fruits and vegetables. Fortunately, those fruits and vegetables still have within them those antioxidants, those phytonutrients that we're going to talk about tomorrow, that actually fight to counteract any problems with that. But I'm a believer in organic fruits and vegetables if you can afford to buy them. I am a big believer in growing your own. So that's one way to get around that. Yes?
Yeah, thanks for the information you provided so far. I have a friend who I know someone who has chronic fatigue. I'm just wondering if there's been any new light shed on that subject in regards to diet, any treatments available or anything like that?
Ah, interesting. I was reading something just recently about that, and there isn't any groundbreaking research that has said this is going to completely eliminate any incidence or risk of chronic fatigue syndrome, that's for sure. But again, a plant-based diet is going to give you the very best opportunity to fight all of the issues that come along with chronic disease, chronic fatigue syndrome. No question about that. And I think tomorrow afternoon, as you understand what some of the particular substances within foods are that help with that, you'll see why that is.
You mentioned that there'd been a tweaking of the CHIP program. What did that entail?
Oh, okay. How many are aware of the revised CHIP program? A few of you, not too many of you. Okay. Well, within the last 2 years, the South Pacific Division has actually acquired the CHIP program. and which was Hansdale, Dr. Hansdale from the US. You probably are aware of the older program. Is that what you're saying? Yes. And he needed help with updating it. He was very, very, very grateful for the assistance, and so the South Pacific Division asked the Sanitarium to do the revision. So there are a number of dietitians who worked on that project, and it really is an extraordinary resource that churches can now use within their programs as a health evangelism program. It's going to be used in May in the Greater Sydney Conference, from where my husband, who's a pastor, and I work, and it looks at all the elements of chronic disease. What are the risks? What foods we should be eating? And it's brought it right up to date to 2012, essentially, which is the year that it was revised, and it's got lots of very, very good information in there. So in order to run a program like that, I think you could talk to Nathan. Nathan knows a lot about it, and he will put you on to how to get in touch with the right people. Pardon?
Do you think that the CHIP program is sustainable?
They are doing some long-term studies now. They've certainly seen, with the 10,000 or so participants that have gone through, some amazing results. Personally, I'm not here to sell you the CHIP program, but it does, in fact, it utilises the wonderful knowledge that we have on plant-based diets and has produced it in a way that's easy to provide to the community in a highly professional way. Yep.
Is there one more question, and then we'll take this as the last question at least.